This is one of the tankiest builds I've ever played. I've been using it in most of our recent videos and gotten a lot of requests for the path of building, so I decided I would just put together a build showcase. Hi, it's Lerald, and this is my version of a Pathofexile's Machination Lightning Strike of Arcing champion. Before I get into the build, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's talk about this build and what makes it special. It's a combination of several really powerful, unique mechanics that have horrible downsides. This build combines them all in a way that basically negates every one of the downsides to make you insanely tanky and super hard hitting. You also get Overleech, so it's just really hard to die on this build, although I still found the way to do that plenty of times during ultimatum trials. This was my last build of the league, so I basically spent all of the currency I had farmed up, but it can be done on a relatively low budget setup. Usually I would save the FAQ part of the video until the end, but I kind of want to cover that now. You don't need a Mage Blood to make this build work. It's a champion build. You can run a Perseverance belt instead of a Mage Blood, and that's like 1 chaos. And it's really not that far off in terms of overall value. It's just not as consistent as a Mage Blood, obviously, and not as good at being zoomy. You also don't need Awakened Gems. You don't need Flesh and Flame. You don't need any of the expensive stuff that really tops off the build. That's all icing on the cake, but icing does make cake better, and so does all that expensive stuff that you throw onto the build as you're reaching the end game. You don't need Vol Lightning Strike. It just gives you a cooldown to help burst down tanky rares and unique, so it's really good to have, but it's not mandatory for it to function. You also don't need Lightning Strike of Arcing. I played around with regular Lightning Strike and Lightning Strike of Arcing, and I prefer Arcing because it's fun and new and different, and I like it more than regular Lightning Strike for mapping because it does clear out packs a lot more consistently. It just looks really cool also, but it does deal slightly less damage in single target, so regular Lightning Strike works just fine. If you run regular Lightning Strike, do make sure that you get the Eldritch Implicit on your gloves that makes your projectiles pierce an additional target. You also don't need Affliction Charms. This build is super versatile and can adapt to any league mechanic, so it's not reliant on Affliction Charms to function. They have granted some nice bonuses like Culling Strike and Elemental Reflect immunity, but you can attach Cull to Whirling Blades and you can just not do Elemental Reflect maps. This is all fine. In terms of using this build as a league starter, the specific iteration that I'm using is reliant on a unique item from Ultimatum, and specifically from the Trial Master, so it's not league startable per se, but nothing you absolutely require is really all that rare other than the shield Pathofexile's Machination. This makes it a pretty great second build of a league, and you could very realistically just league start a regular Lightning Strike champ and then farm up or purchase a Pathofexile's Machination and transition right into this build. The only other particularly difficult things that you really need are a 6-link Doriani's prototype, which isn't that hard to get, and crafting a nice weapon. You could start small and work your way up on the weapon. In terms of doing in-game content, this build can basically handle everything. It dealt with Ultimatum pretty effortlessly. It laughs at waves 30 Simulacrums. I mean, I face-tanked multiple Kostas in Simulacrum at like 21 and 27, and then again at 30. It is the kind of build that you can get rolling for cheap and then just dump tons of currency into it as the league progresses, and it will scale up proportionally to the investment that you've put in. As for bossing, it's not a build that does like hundreds of millions of DPS, normally speaking, so I probably wouldn't want to try to do any sort of uber bossing with it, but for killing regular bosses, it'll absolutely shred those guys, no problem. But yeah, generally speaking, for uber bossing, more gimmicky builds or very specific types of glass cannon builds are kind of more what you're looking for, and this build is really more structured around mapping, clearing packs of enemies, simulacrums, that sort of thing, which it does extremely well. I'll just say that this is my favorite build that I've played in a while. I have really enjoyed it. I like the MTX on Lightning Strike as well. I like how tanky the build feels. It's all just been a really good experience. Alright, so here I have my character, Dr. Pepper Body Spray, and let's just start off by looking at the PoE wiki pages of some of the unique items that are kind of mandatory for the build. Pathofexile's Machination, it's the sort of uniting unique of the whole build. It really is the thing that makes everything function. Won't really work the same way without this unique, so let's take a look at it. It is a shield that has 6 keystones on it, and that's all it has. It's just 6 keystones, no other stats of any kind armor and energy shield and a decent chance to block. Now the keystones, they give you all of this massive wall of effects. Some of them are redundant with each other. Just to kind of run through them, you gain energy shield based off your maximum life. You have damage taken bypassing energy shield, and then also, a redundant effect. You have 50% of elemental damage taken as chaos damage. This is very important. You have 5% increased max chaos res, also very important. And you have, when you reach full energy shield, sacrifice all energy shield to gain 5% to all max reses, including chaos, for 4 seconds. Massively important. Okay, you have energy shield starting at 0, you lose energy shield every second, you can't recharge or regenerate it. Energy shield recharge instead applies to life. So if you were to burn out some of your life for a bit, like I will tab back in here and let Blood Rage tick out here, and then I'll just see where is that gem. I'll just take it out so that it falls off. As you can see, no regen, and then just like energy shield, it turns back on like that. Life leech effects are not removed at full life. They instead recover energy shield while on full life. And this is how we reach full energy shield and give ourselves that 5% all res for 4 seconds, which we have enough leech from all of this to basically maintain that buff permanently. Total recovery from life leech is doubled. Great. Total recovery from life leech is doubled, 50% less. So net neutral leech rate cap, that's fine, but the base underlying amount is pretty decent. Life regen has no effect, and then also, a redundant reduction in life regen rate. So you have all these kind of weird overlapping, sometimes incongruous bonuses, but basically the main things here are that you're converting a lot of your elemental damage into chaos. You have increased chaos res. You have Slayer Overleach that fuels into your energy shield and then gives you this massive all res buff. We combine that with 2 other bonuses here. The first one is Doriani's Prototype, which makes it so that lightning res doesn't affect your lightning damage taken. It makes it so that your lightning res is applied to nearby enemies. So you have this incentive to have massively negative lightning res. You also are incapable of dealing any non-lightning damage, so you only want to have lightning damage on your weapon. You only want to have any sort of lightning damage modifier, so things like Herald of Ice won't do anything. You're only capable of dealing lightning damage. It also makes it so that armor applies to lightning damage taken from hits. This is fine because we're also using Lethal Pride, and we are specifically using a Rockiata Lethal Pride, which makes 50% of all cold and lightning damage taken be converted into fire damage, and then it gives you less lightning res. So because of all of these, we want to have our lightning res as low as possible because we are converting 50% of our lightning damage taken into fire damage and 50% into chaos damage. We're not taking any lightning damage at all. We're also not taking any cold damage at all. So we want to do everything we can to reduce those resistances. And right now I'm at exactly minus 100 lightning res, which means that enemies I fight that are near me are also at minus 100 lightning res. This means that throwing anything onto them like a conductivity curse, that's not going to reduce their lightning resistance because their lightning resistance is my negative lightning resistance, negative 100. It's the same as mine. Instead, we're able to use some effects, like I'll highlight some of them on the tree here, things like damage with weapons penetrates 8% of lightning resistance, or let's see, I have another one down here. Attack damage penetrates 10% of enemy elemental resistances. So these two combine and you can hit an enemy as though you were hitting them at negative 118 if your base is 100, adding that 10 and 8 together. But by default, you're not able to do anything to affect their resistances, so that is why we would want to use things like Assassin's Marks. We would use marks to increase our crit chance, to increase our damage dealt to enemies, and not really worry about trying to reduce their resistances any further. And we also want to use as many things as we can in our build to reduce our own resistances and then compensate for this by getting as much fire res and chaos res as we can. So things like Melding of the Flesh, which reduce your elemental resistances, are actually DPS increases. Blue Eldritch Altars that reduce your lightning res are DPS increases. Thread of Hope with negative resistances, those are DPS increases. And also a Venter's Gamble with a negative lightning resistance roll is a DPS increase. Now I happen to have this one lying around with Quant and Rarity. I think, if I remember correctly, I had this one lying around, certainly one like this. I think ideally, if you're kind of operating on a budget, you could get one with relatively low quant and rarity rolls, high fire res roll, low light res roll, cold res roll, doesn't matter at all. And that would probably be extremely cheap. Like you could They can go all the way down to -25. This is, you know, because we're late in the league, the best I could do is -20 lightning res. But if you could get one that's like 40 fire res and -25 lightning res, that is a mirror tier ring, essentially. And if the quant and rarity roll on it aren't great, it's probably going to be less than a divine, which is pretty good. So this is kind of all of the ways that we're able to scale both our damage and our defense. We're able to funnel all of our defensive focus into just getting as much fire res as we can and chaos res as we can to offset all of the negative elemental resistance, quote unquote, bonuses, debuffs, whatever way you want to put it. We're trying to offset all of those and just focus on fire res, focus on chaos res, and then focus on all the other standard defensive layers. So armor, evasion, spell suppression. I have spell suppression fractured on all of my pieces of gear to make them a little easier to craft. And then we have all of that damage conversion, which is really helpful. There's something kind of powerful in Path of Exile about converting damage. So say you're fighting an enemy that has like a lot of cold damage, they'll probably have some cold penetration as well. I think Shaper and Elder have this kind of thing going on, right? Where they'll hit you with a cold ability, it deals a bunch of cold damage, but it also has a massive amount of cold resistance penetration. So by converting that damage into fire damage or chaos damage or both, by converting it away from cold, that cold penetration doesn't do anything anymore because it's not fire pen and it's not chaos pen. It's just cold pen, but it's not doing cold damage anymore. So this allows you to like significantly increase your damage reduction, even though it would seem like, you know, it's a net neutral. You're just converting one type into another. You're actually significantly improving your damage reduction by having damage conversion built in. All right, so let's take a look at the path of building. This is the Atlas tree I've gone with. This is, I think, a level 98 tree. If I were to go up to level 100 with this build, I would probably socket in just a couple of these nodes here that are available through Thread of Hope from the Shadows, which gives you a lot of increased elusive effect, and we do have elusive up pretty much all the time because we're using Nightblade as one of our support gems. And then I would probably just take Sleight of Hand. It's about 5% more DPS, which is pretty good. I think I'll like this. I think this works out pretty well. You know, you don't absolutely require the cluster jewels, but they do help get you up to 100% crit chance on an enemy that is cursed, so that's good. One thing I kind of skipped over in going through this on the first pass was just the Ascendancy for champion. This is kind of a standard setup, but I just want to highlight just how incredibly strong all of these nodes are. Unstoppable Hero gives you so much armor and evasion rating and attack speed and stun immunity while you're fortified, and then Fortitude just gives you 20 fortification, 20% less damage taken from all hits. Pretty crazy in conjunction with all of the other defensive layers you have. First to strike, last to fall makes it so that you intimidate all enemies, so they just basically do 10% more damage to everything, and it gives you Adrenaline, which is both a super powerful defensive lifeline, giving you 25% of life back, and removing all ailments, burning, all that kind of thing when you get it, if your health drops below 50%. But also it gives you 100% increased damage, 25% attack, cast, and move speed, and another 10% physical DR as though you didn't already need enough. So just a really, really powerful combination of like offensive power and defensive lifeline and kind of an offensive cooldown. And then finally, Inspirational, another really powerful node here. It gives you banner skills, have no reservation cost, so you can run them for free. Gives you 30% increased effective non-curse orders from skills. That's so incredibly good. Hypothetically, you could like throw down banners for some of that life regen and the recreating them to get stages back. I think that was their intended gameplay loop, was that you would throw down banners to buff yourself and give some life back and then pick them back up. I've never done that at any point, at least on purpose. I'm not going to start now, but it does seem like it is probably useful for somebody who's willing to go to that level of micromanagement, but that ain't me. Let's take a look at the skills here. I'm using Vol Lightning Strike of Arcing. I bought one of these and I had a regular Lightning Strike of Arcing, and I just went like, I guess I'll slap a Vol Orb on it, and then it also turned into a Vol Lightning Strike of Arcing. It's like, oh well, we're at the end of the league. I guess it doesn't really matter. I should have probably Vol'd first, though, in hindsight. You'll want to use Nightblade support. That's pretty normal for any sort of build that uses claws or daggers, and this build does. It uses a claw. It's just a massive increase to your damage output. Really, really valuable support gem. Awakened Edited Lightning damage is pretty cheap and adds a lot of damage into this build. Volatility support adds a lot of damage, relatively new support gem, and it's pretty good at adding damage, as you can see. And then Awaken Ellie damage with attacks is always a good one on any sort of elemental damage attack build. And finally, Awaken Multi-Strike. This is like a massively expensive support gem. You don't have to run Awaken Multi-Strike until you can afford it. You can just run regular. I did that for a while. It worked really well with just the regular, but obviously the reason that Awaken Multi-Strike is so expensive is that it is very good. It's an attack build, so it has the unfortunate downside of needing to use both Ancestral Protector and Ancestral War Chief, and then socket them with a multiple totem support and throw those down anytime you're fighting a pesky or more tanky kind of rare, or any sort of unique that's going to take you a while. Now, as for auras, this is a champion build, so Determination and Grace are kind of the order of the day, and because we're converting everything into fire, we want to do everything we can to get our max fire res up and just get our regular fire res up also. So running Purity of Fire is really, really valuable here because we have so many negative resistance debuffs from uniques in our tree. So that is really helpful to run Purity of Fire, really helps with your defenses, and then we're running Defiance, Banner, and Wrath socketed to both Empower and Arrogance, and the reason for that, if I can show it off in game here, is because we're running an All's Uprising necklace, so Wrath has no reservation. We're playing a champion, so banners are also free. So we kind of want to socket them into Empower, which has a really nasty reservation modifier. You normally wouldn't use it on auras, and the same goes for Arrogance. You know, you don't want to I mean, for builds that are okay with reserving their life, Arrogance is obviously mandatory, but for this kind of a build, that would be really bad. But because they have 0 cost on mana, then getting 24% increased aura effect through running Arrogance support on these is just really, really good for increasing our damage output. And our tankiness, I suppose, thanks to Defiance Banner. Now, if you were running a Perseverance belt, that would actually be a damage increase as well to get more armor and evasion. I have Molten Shell as well. I just have it on left click. You could run Vol Molten Shell if you're willing to deal with the extra keybind, but then that kind of competes with Vol Lightning Strike for your souls, and I'd rather not have to deal with that. As we can see, the effective health pool is 112 with Molten Shell off. I think I have Progenesis turned on, so if we turn that all completely off, we're looking at like 85k, but we have relatively high uptime on both of those, so between the two of them, we're in the 100k effective health range, something like that, and we are leeching like 1800 life a second, so doing pretty good. We're running Whirling Blades just for getting around. I haven't linked to faster attack support right now. In the future, without Culling Strike built into the build due to Affliction Charms, I would probably run Cull on the Whirling Blades there, or maybe I would drop Molten Shell, maybe I would drop Molten Shell, maybe, and run Whirling Blades faster attacks and Cull. I don't know, I'd think about it depending on what kind of content I was doing. And then finally, we have Assassin's Mark with Mark on Hit just for easy automation, and then Flame Dash for mobility, Blood Rage for, you know, the damage, the attack speed. Now let's look at items. Most of these things are rare pieces of gear. I guess it's kind of a 50-50 split now that I really look at it and think about it. But a lot of these things, like the Venter's Gamble, isn't a requirement. It's just that running one with a negative light res roll on it is such a good damage increase. Mage Blood obviously could be replaced with a Perseverance. That's fine. I am currently running Progenesis. I played with Bottled Faith earlier on with them being kind of cheap, and it really helped my damage output for a while. You could also just run a life flask of like bleed immunity. That works pretty well. Ultimately, what you're going for on your rare gear is some mix of fire res, chaos res, and suppression. And then if you can get plus to level of socketed AoE gems, you want one of either your gloves or helm to have the +2 roll where you like get your suffixes set up, lock them, and then use one of these bad boys, a Veiled Chaos Orb, and unveil +2 to socketed AoE gems. You want to get that on either your helm or your gloves, one of those pieces, so that you can then put Purity of Fire in there and get that +2 levels to Purity of Fire and get that extra +1 to max fire res. All right, I'll briefly talk about mana here. So I have a minus mana cost of non-channeling skills on a ring. If I take it off, I can't actually attack. So I found that to be pretty useful. You really only need it on the one. I am using a reduced mana cost of skills, Flask suffix, but I'm able to cast Lightning Strike without that. Like, I will eventually run out of mana. I think the reason I like that so much is just simply that it makes it so that I can infinitely sit here and cast Lightning Strike in my hideout, but it's not necessary. It's not mandatory. by any stretch. It's just sort of convenient to have. But you're not required to like run a mage blood to be able to fix your mana easily, and then you have to jump through a bunch of hoops if that's not the case. Like I was very, very effortlessly jumping around and leeching my mana up and doing just fine playing this with a Perseverance as well. I think I've pretty much covered all of the gear. One thing I want to point out is that the Anoint is a crystal skin Anoint. I did that so that it would be easier to fix my elemental ailment avoidance. So you get 20% from crystal skin, and you get 20% from this wheel. 8 from thick skin, and then 4 from each of the small nodes that you take along the way. So that's 40%. Then you need to pick up 60% somewhere else. The easiest place to do that is on your boots. You can run if you're using the tier 1 essences, you can get a 35% chance to avoid elemental ailments roll. If you use Eater of Worlds implicits and then improve them with a Orb of Conflict, you are able to get that number up to at least 25% chance to avoid elemental ailments. So between those two, 35 and 25, that's 60. And then you combine that with the 20 from this wheel and 20 from crystal skin, which is 40. That gives you a 100% chance to avoid elemental ailments overall. And that's exactly what you need. In terms of the cluster jewels, I think I'm pretty much running the same one in every single spot. For the medium cluster jewels, I'm just running crit chance cluster jewels with pressure points and quick getaway as the two skills that I want. Yeah, I'm just running two medium cluster jewels, no smalls right now. And that works really well. These help a tiny bit with fixing some of your stats, things like chaos res and intelligence and strength. Fixing stats can be a little bit difficult in this build. You do have a lot of pressure, especially at the higher end of gearing, on all of your stats because you're trying to fix fire res, you're trying to fix chaos res, and like to that end I am running a ruby flask. That is not something I would do in a perseverance build. I would probably just have to relax some of the gearing elsewhere, lose maybe the attack speed on gloves suffix, even though I don't like to do that, to pick up like some fire res there, or I don't know. I would definitely have to make some sort of sacrifices somewhere in the gearing process to be able to pick up enough fire res to not run a ruby flask if I were playing Perseverance. I think honestly, probably the best way to fix that is just not to run as many Threads of Hope, or maybe not run the melding, although melding is really good for increasing your damage by, like, look at this, 100% negative lightning res. If I take the melding out, I'm probably going to be at 61. Yeah, rough. That's like more than 40% more damage by running that melding. It's pretty hard to give that up, but I think that probably is the easiest way to fix your resistances, because look, I go to 190 fire res instead of the 114 that I'm currently at. As for the large cluster jewels, you have a lot of freedom with them. I think there's maybe one really like important node to take, but honestly I think you can kind of make do with a lot of different possibilities. You want to use claw and dagger large cluster jewels. That is definitely something that's really important. And then just some really good options available for notable skills are things like Feed the Fury, which gives you leech and damage and attack speed while leeching, and since you're basically always leeching, that's really good. The same goes for Fuel the Fight. You don't need that for, like, you know, you can see the mana leech rate that I'm getting. I'm already at the cap without Fuel the Fight, so you don't need that to sustain, but it does give you 20% increased damage and while leeching, which is all the time, and 8% attack speed, so it's pretty good for damage output. And then again, Fuel the Fury, like, or Feed the Fury, you don't need that to sustain. It's not a build enabling mod, it just adds a lot of damage. Martial Prowess adds a fair amount of damage as well, but again, not build enabling in any way. What is sort of build enabling maybe is Fan of Blades. Like, I like this a lot. As you can see, it's not really showing any damage since I'm on melee hit right now, but if I switch over to projectiles, it adds a relatively small amount of actual damage. The single target damage contribution that it provides is basically nothing, but it adds more projectiles, and since we're running Vol Lightning Strike of arcing rather than just regular Vol Lightning Strike, that really adds up to a lot more clear. So getting at least one Fan of Blades is good, just to give yourself a lot more clear. If you can get one on each of your large cluster jewels, that's good, but this is usually a very expensive cluster jewel node, so you really only need one for, like, just quality of life purposes. You don't need any at all, but it is sort of something nice to pursue. All right, let's talk about build disabling mods. I think one of the things I like so much about this build is that it's barely disabled by any mods at all. The only things that it can't do are can't leech and reduced effect of non-curse auras from skills. I really don't like to do that, but it technically can. And I think in the future, without charms, you wouldn't be able to do reflect. Realistically, maybe you could find some way to get around that. I think probably the best way to get around reflect is just to run like reflect sextants on maps, but generally speaking, that's about the only 3 mods that really are any sort of problem, which is pretty amazing. In terms of the Pantheon, I'm running Lunaris since I'm doing mostly mapping content, lots of enemies around me. It's nice to have more fizz damage reduction, more move speed. You know, the other bonuses are fine too. And then I'm running Ralakesh because I just haven't bothered to give myself a Corrupted Blood immune jewel. We're late in the league. It's pretty hard to actually get one. Just getting someone to like log on and sell me a Corrupted Blood immune jewel that is one of the jewels I would want to run is kind of difficult. But I think if I had Corrupted Blood somewhere else in the build, maybe I was just running a life flask that made me bleed immune, that would work. Then I would probably switch over to Aberrath just because Burning Ground is such a big annoyance. As for killing all the bandits, that's what you do. You kill them all. Pretty obvious that all passive points are extremely valuable in this build. And then for leveling, I did Smite, Hollow Palm, the standard speed leveling setup. It was super fast and easy. Steel Champ will level like a dream at League Start, though. It's one of the best leveling builds. I really love the state of Steel Champ right now. You can also just play Lightning Strike. Like I just went and bought a level 1 gem just to make sure, and you can go at it from level 12. It works decently while leveling. I think Steel Champ is probably better earlier on, but I think Lightning Strike is probably a pretty decent starter build. It's definitely something I'm thinking about looking into as like a possible League Starter build, League Starter guide for it, something that's an alternative to Toxic Rain that can do like content such as Legion really well, stuff that clears off screen, because that's sort of the one weakness of Toxic Rain. Favorite build, but always had a little bit of trouble hitting anything off screen since you can only target stuff that's on screen with it. And Lightning Strike doesn't have that limitation, so would be kind of a fun alternative. It scales very differently. I've really had a lot of fun playing this build. I'm just going to pipe in some more footage of me doing stuff. I really like the way that this build looks too. It's really a lot of fun. And just a very, very different play style from a lot of the other stuff that I've been playing more recently. So it's just been a really good change of pace. I definitely think I will play something along these lines in future leagues. I don't know if it'll be specifically this build, but I'm really glad I took the time to play this one in Affliction League because it's super fun and felt super rewarding as well. All right, I think that about covers it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Bye.